And let's begin today's talk. The talk is going to be delivered by Professor Defeng Li, Professor Li. So, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, students and colleagues. My name is Li Chao, and I'm from the Department of Chinese and Bilingual Studies of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And today it is my great pleasure to invite Professor Defeng Li from the University of Macau to give us a talk, right? And the talk is entitled Sense Making in Corpus-based Translation Studies with reference to Hongloumeng translations. Now, and we are very fortunate today, right, and to have the opportunity to invite such a high caliber scholar as Professor Li. As you know, and Professor Li, and to some extent is a household name, right, in translation studies. And so this is indeed our great honor. And we also want to thank Xin Waikin Chinese Humanities Development Fund. And the funding body is very kind to sponsor today's talk. Without their generous support, and the talk wouldn't have been possible. And so Professor Li is already ready to give us the speech. So, and before he delivers the speech, now let me give all of you a brief introduction about Professor Li. Now, Professor Li is professor from the University of Macau. And he is Professor of Translation Studies and Director of the Center for Translation, Director of the Center for Studies of Translation, Interpreting and Cognition at the university. Now, and this center has increasingly become one of the leading research units in the world on cognitive processes through translation and also interpreting, as everybody knows. And previously, he taught at School of Oriental and African Studies of University of London, where he served as chair of the Center for Translation Studies. He also taught at the Department of Translation, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, for a decade. He also served in adjunct or visiting capacity as Dean of the School of Foreign Languages, Shandong University, during 2006 to 2011, and visiting chair professor of translation studies at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And Professor Li is currently president of World Interpreter and Translator Training Association, WITA. And I think most of us have heard of the name, right? Because a lot of conferences and also workshops and also a lot of talks, right, have been organized under the auspices of this organization, that is the WITA, right? So, and also, Professor Li is the president of International Association of Translation, Interpreting and Cognition, vice president of Chinese Corpus Translation Studies Association, and also vice president of Chinese Cognitive Translation Studies Association. He is also chief editor of the Scopus Index, Springer New Frontiers in Translation Studies series. So, and he just told me that he welcomes book proposals from all interested parties, right, to submit book proposals to this very prestigious book series on translation studies under his editorship. Okay, so, and I think that's my brief introduction about Professor Li, right? And without further ado, and let's welcome Professor Li to give us the speech, right? And by the way, so after the speech is over, and I am also very pleased to have the presence of Professor Ricardo Moretto, right, from Shanghai International University. That is the what is that? Shanghai International Studies University, right? Sorry, Ricardo is there, right? And he has kindly agreed to chair the Q&A section. So you can see we really value this very good opportunity, right? But of course, before that, I'm going to also introduce Professor Ricardo Moretto to you after Professor Defeng Li's speech is over. Okay. So now, Professor Li, the time is yours.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks to Professor Li Chao my younger brother in translation studies, for the invitation and also the kind introduction. I also want to thank Hongloumeng, Dr. Liu, for arranging all this. Hongloumeng started his PhD program with me at the Chinese University of Hong Kong before I left for
many people probably know
the
that,
University of Hong
yeah.
Kong some years ago, right? So that was before I left CUHK for SOAS University of London. I'm very pleased that he's doing well, together, with the our very well-known scholar, Professor Detao Li, right? So that's very good to know. And I think I should also probably take the opportunity to thank Professor Ricardo Morato of Shanghai International Studies University, who's most graciously agreed to host the QA session later on. Right, so I think it's probably also worth mentioning that Ricardo and I have been working together on a number of literature and translation studies projects. We are actually currently co-editing 2 book series, one for Routledge, focusing on a multi-cultural approach to translation to Chinese literature, and the other is for Shanghai Foreign Language Education Press, Shanghai 外语教育出版社. This one focuses more on interpreting studies, and it's going to be published in both English and Chinese. So we'll welcome proposals for both series, right? So it looks like I've done quite a bit of advertising, right? So yeah, so but anyway, so I thank Professor Ricardo Morato for agreeing to chair the QA session. And I've just been told by Professor Li that many of the students probably in the audience have read the article on which I'm going to speaking on. So I expect that you have some questions for Ricardo. So it's important that you prepare some questions for him, but no, for me, but without questions, he will be sharing nothing, right? So, right. Back to our topic today. It's sense making in translation studies with special reference to Hongloumeng translation. So I think probably at this point I should share my screen. Just bear with me a little bit, see how I do that. Now I was able to do it earlier, right? Okay. So you can see the screen now, right? Is it? Okay, that's good. Right, sense making in corpus translation studies, as I mentioned, because this is pretty much based on a article actually Hongloumeng and I co-authored some years ago. Some of you, as I said, like you have knew that I wrote this chapter, and actually it's been attracting citations all these years. So in a sense, it's an old article, but I do have very good reasons to, go back to the issue today. First of all, because this whole just mentioned, this is, part of the Xinwei Kang Chinese Humanities Development Fund lecture series. So I need to find a topic appropriate for this occasion. But I think more importantly, this topic will enable me to share my recent thoughts on translation studies. So I actually have to refer to a talk I gave 3 weeks ago. I gave a lecture at a conference organized by Sun Sanjun of Beijing Foreign Studies University. And that conference focused on the difficulties of translation and by extension, the difficulties in translation studies. And the topic I spoke on was towards a theory of interpretive translation studies. Let me just move the screen a bit. So today's talk is sort of a follow-up or a sequel to my earlier lecture on interpretive translation studies. In that talk, I outlined the development of translation studies, and on that basis, I argued for a theory of interpretive translation studies, so that translation studies scholars can best take stock of modern technologies such as corpus, eye trackers, FNIRS, FMMI, and benefit from the scientific rigor accorded to us by technologies and the quantification enabled by these technologies, as exemplified in corpus translation studies and cognitive translation studies, among other areas of research. I also discussed briefly what I meant by interpretive translation studies, and more importantly, how to conduct interpretive translation studies, and why we should move on to this stage, which I call the next stage of translation studies. That is the, we sort of shift the paradigm further from descriptive translation studies to interpretive translation studies, which I see as the second major paradigm shift in translation studies. So as we all know that, there are two areas that have been growing really fast and have attracted much research attention in translation studies over the past few decades. And they are corpus translation studies and cognitive translation studies, as you can see here. And, the motivation behind these fast development are varied, but I think one reason is most important, at least most relevant for the talk today, is the pursuit of scientific rigor, in translation research amongst translation studies scholars. Because we became so interested in the objectivity and the quantification and also the statistics that these technologies can provide us when we research the product, the process, and the function of translation. This is good. I mean, the objectivity, the rigor, and the quantification are all very useful, and they do put us in a stronger position in our research. However, as far as I see, this enthusiasm about quantification also brought about a problem, or several problems. I think one of the biggest problem, or the biggest problem, is that I think many studies have merely stopped at the provision of statistical data on texts, such as type token ratios, sentence length, lexic density, but without really exploring the reasons and causes that have caused or brought about these results, right? So in many cases, or in many instances, as we have observed in many conferences and even in many published articles, you can see these kind of data-based empirical studies somehow become a number game. We build the corpus, we use these tools and then generate a bunch of statistics without really making sense of these numbers, or really do minimal in terms of the interpretation of these numbers. Right. So if you analyze these research articles, you can see this is the basic structure, right? You have research questions, you tell us about the design of the corpus, and then the statistics, and then report the statistics, and almost that's the end. Or if there is any interpretation, it's really minimal, a few lines, right? Superficial explanation. But of course, according to Sarah Laveosa, one of the earlier scholars of corpus translation studies, corpus translation studies is not merely to unveil the nature of the third code per se. So the third code referring to the translated language, right? Or we sometimes call it the interlanguage of translation, which is not, of course, the original language, but not the translation of the target language, the pure authentic target language yet. So it's somewhere in between. That's why we call it the third code. But most importantly, to understand the specific constraints, pressures, and motivations that influence the act of translating and underlie its unique language. So to me, I've been arguing that, you know, a truly useful corpus study should at least carry two features. First of all, it does not merely present statistical results to prove the obvious or the known. Secondly, it goes further to explain and interpret the statistical results by looking at the causes for such tendencies in these statistical results. So I think, you know, a useful corpus study has to have an additional part, which is called sense making. That is, after you've obtained, you know, you've done all the job and then you've obtained these numbers, these statistics, the real thing begins. That is the interpretation of these numbers, the explanation of these numbers. You need to tell us, what do these numbers tell us about translation?
Personally,
yes.
Sorry for the interruption. And somebody and some audience says that your PPT is on a note mode. Can you enlarge your PPT a bit? Yeah, it's a note.
Let's see. Maybe.
Oh, it's already the line.
Let me try.
If you can make it full screen.
Yeah, full screen. Make it full screen. Can you?
It is a full screen.
It's
actually, it's just. Is it better now? No.
No, the same. It's okay. It's a little bit.
Yeah, I know. Because I don't know how to describe this, but this is what I've made it full screen. This is probably as much as I can do today. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, just.
But anyway, I still can read it. Yeah, I
yeah,
still can read it.
Just listen. Then
I think it's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, hold on.
Oh yeah, better. Much better now.
Yeah, very good, very good.
Very good
now.
Very good now. 很好了。对对。
Okay.
突然间好，对对 OK。
Let's see. Duplicate second screen on it. Let me try second screen on this if that's better. Is it better now? Not really.
Very good. Much larger now. I mean this.
Much larger.
But now I return to previous mode, and 这又不行了，刚才就可以，是吧？
What can we do? Let's see. I don't know. Let me just unplug this and then try.
It works momentarily, but now it's not. Oh yeah, it's okay now. It's very good. Now it's very good. Right?
Better now? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then I'll just go on like this. Right. So anyway, so I was saying that we do need to have this additional part of sense making. I consider that as pivotal and essential. Okay. And the same actually can be said about cognitive translation studies. You know, so, you know, because of time constraint, I'm not going to elaborate on this part. And of course, that's not our focus today. So if I want to summarize, you know, what I've said so far, I believe that, you know, these corpus and eye trackers or any other instruments, they are merely tools. And they are very useful tools, of course. They help us to describe the text, describe the process, describe the function, right? In the form of statistics, in the form of numbers. However, the eventual goal is interpretation of these numbers, right? So we always have to, when we've got these numbers, so we'll always have to ask us the questions, so what, right? So what do these numbers tell us about the process, product, and function of translation or interpreting, right? So that's why I'm saying that I think, you know, we're probably moving into a new paradigm, which is called interpretive translation studies. You know, what is interpretive translation studies? I don't have a detailed definition yet, but I think, as you can see, it's a step forward compared with the descriptive translation studies. And it's based, of course, the interpretation is based on the descriptions of translation. So we're not saying that the description is not important. The description, of course, is very important, right? Because they serve as the foundation of interpretation and theory construction, right? According to Gilgan et al. And of course, the interpretation should be grounded in existing theories, on translation or related fields. So the real thing for these data-based empirical research is the theorizing with new insights. Okay. So I believe that theorization is at the core of interpretive translation studies. How do we do that? And I think one of the ways to do that is to really ask us these questions, these so what questions. For example, what if we are conducting a corpus translation, corpus-assisted translation research, when we've got all these numbers, these are the kind of questions we should ask. Okay, what do these numbers tell about the process and the product of translation? How did the translation come about the way it did? Why did the translation come out the way it did, right? And what social, cultural, political effects did the translation produce on the target language and target culture? So such analysis, according to Sadania and O'Brien, will necessarily involve contextualization of the results, right? So, and in this effort, the study of paratexts to the text in examination is very useful, okay? And I have argued on different occasions for a 3P plus C model of contextualization or interpretation, as you can see in this graph here, right? You can see we have process, product, participants, right? Intertwined. However, whoever we are studying, right? Whichever we are focusing, the last step is to put the study in the context, in a larger context, the cultural, social, cultural, political context. Right? And as I said, like in this effort, the paratextual analysis can be very helpful. We are all familiar with the theory of paratextual analysis put forward by Jeanette, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I think this is a good time to really sort of illustrate, how I believe the sense making or the interpretation should be conducted, right? So with this analysis of the 2 English translations of Hongloumeng, this is the part I think many students in the audience have read, okay? This study was inspired, of course, by a seminal article published by Professor Mona Baker of University of Manchester, I think in the year of 2000, right? So, and of course, that at that time was still at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Canon was my PhD student, so we started this project together. And for those online who probably do not really know much about Hongloumeng, here are just a few facts. It's one of the greatest classical Chinese novels, or even the greatest classical Chinese novel, by Cao Xueqing and Gao E, came out in the 18th century in Qing Dynasty of China. It details the sort of the process of 2 big families of the Zhao clan, falling from prestige to disgrace, right? And of course, it's also believed to be a sort of semi-autobiographical novel mirroring the fortunes of the author's own family, right? And it is remarkable because, it has a huge cast of characters, 30 main characters and over 400 minor ones, most of them females. And it's also, remarkable because of its precise and detailed observation of the life and social structure, which was typical of the 18th century Chinese aristocracy. We know that it's being translated into many different languages, and now probably 10 English translations of this novel already. As I said, this work was inspired by the research done by Professor Baker. And when we started this project, we had two purposes. One is really to compare the translation styles of two groups of translators, right? David Hawkes, John Minford, and the other group, Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, right? But we have a more important purpose, which is to move beyond verifying the obvious, to use the words by Tomashko, to really look at the possible reasons behind the choices made by the two different groups of translators. And of course, then we'll build the corpus, right? And of course, a lot's going on into the design, the technical work, which I'm not going to detail here. So what we were able to sort of come up with are these facts. We call it descriptive statistics. Okay, these are the description about the work that we were observing. But here I need to remind you that we only had time to look at the first 15 chapters of the work, right? So here are a few facts that we identified. For example, Hawkes used over 21,000 more words than the Youngs, just for the first 15 chapters, right? So that's like over 20,000 words, a difference of over 20%, right? And then the Youngs used a wider range of vocabulary as compared to Hawkes. I think that's quite sort of a pleasant surprise, because generally we believe that Hawkes as a native English speaker, very well educated professor at the Oxford University, we thought he would have a better command, more skillful command of the English language. So we thought that he would probably have used a wider range of vocabulary in the translation. However, the corpus found the opposite. We do have very good explanations for that. And then that's the sense-making part. And then, of course, on average, Hawkes used significantly longer sentences than the Youngs. Okay. As I said, sense-making, interpreting, right, is the key. In descriptive statistical research on translation, we have these quotes from well-known prominent translation scholars, which I'm not going to read, just to show you this is not just my own view. I think many believe this is what we should do. And as you have just seen that we have three sort of major findings. So for today, probably I just have enough time to cover the first one. So we'll just focus on the first one. For example, why Hawkes' translation was significantly longer than the Young's, just for the first 15 chapters, right? So I think the first reason could be their different approaches to translation of the cultural concepts in the original work. I think anyone who knows Hongloumeng, who's read Hongloumeng, would agree that Hongloumeng abounds in cultural concepts and references to books, plays, poems. They are very well known to many Chinese readers, right? And it's actually called the Encyclopedia of Chinese Culture. Right? So when dealing with the translation of these cultural concepts, I think Hawkes and Young, they actually adopted totally different approaches. For Hawkes, right, he basically relied on paraphrase and explanation. when, in many of the cases when he's trying to translate these, rendering these cultural concepts into English. So the result of that, he amplified the text quite a bit, right? So that's why actually his translation of the first 15 chapters was significantly longer than Young's. While Young aimed for a more faithful translation, and in order to convey these cultural concepts, he used notes, right? For that, I have a quote from Hawkes in his preface to support my claim here. As he said, the text abounds in passages containing references to books, plays, poems, which to the Western reader, lacking the literary background that Cao Xueqing was able to take for granted in his Chinese contemporaries, might often seem puzzling or incomprehensible. Now, this part, I make no apology for having occasionally amplified the text a little in order to make such passages intelligible, right? So he recognized that he's amplified the text, and he's very fine with that. He's saying, I'm not going to apologize for my amplification because I have a very good reason to do that, right? And a specific example from chapter 2, I think for Chinese readers, when you see this, you know immediately what these, refer to. They refer to these, probably the sages in the Chinese history, right? And you can see this is David Hawkes' translation, Yao Sheng Yu, etc. And then here's some addition there, right? All instances of exceptional goodness. This is an addition. It's not in the original, right? And then we're born under the influence of benign forces. And again, another amplification, and all sought to promote the well-being of the societies in which they lived. If we compare, Hawkes' translation with Young's translation, this is what you will see, right? So this is how Yang Xianyi translated this part. Examples of the first are Yao Sheng Yu Tang, King Wen, King Wu Duke, etc., etc. So that's just really a literal, most direct translation of that sentence. However, he added a note, right? So this is note he added. Yao and Sheng were legendary sage kings of ancient China, Yu, founder of the Shah dynasty, etc., etc., etc. So gave lots of specific detailed information about these sages in a note. Oops. But then, okay, if we agree that they have adopted or they adopted different approaches, then we look again behind why do you think they decided to adopt different approaches to translating these cultural concepts. And I think behind their choices is their actually ideology. So ideology here referring, we know that ideology in the translation studies is much broader in its sense. It refers to basically our views of the world, our views of the truth, our views of translation. So it includes our own theory about translation. And we have to admit that we all have theories about translation, although we probably many of us haven't really published anything on translation, but we do have our beliefs about how translation should be done. Okay, so in that sense, it is ideological. It is that relates to their belief about translation. For example, the use of notes in literary translation. Okay, for example, the Young's belief in faithful translation. The translator should be faithful to the original text, for example, but at the same time need to ascertain the fluency of the text. And the result is most likely a compromise of faithfulness and fluency. So that's a quote from Young, when he discusses what translation should be like, right? So he believes in or believed in faithful translation and compromise. But Hawkes has had a very different view on how notes should be used, right? He said, I make no apology for having occasionally amplified the text a little, in order to make the passages intelligible. And the alternative would have been to explain them in footnotes. And the footnotes are all very well in their place, rendering or reading a heavily annotated novel would seem to me rather like trying to play tennis in chains. Very clumsy, right? You won't be able to play tennis well when you are in chains, right? So the same thing for reading a literary piece. He believes that, if you're reading a text with many notes, then that's like playing tennis in chains. As I said, it's more about ideological. That's more like related to political side of one's ideology. Okay, we know, like for Yang Xianyi, he started translation of Hongloumeng in 1947, after he returned from the UK, to China. That's actually before the founding of the new People's Republic of China. But his translation was interrupted by a number of political movements, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. He was thrown into jail, and so was his wife, and they were imprisoned for 4 years. But when they were released, they started working for foreign language press, right? But we have to know this foreign language press is not a commercial press. If you refer to the description of this press, this is what you will see. Okay, you won't be able to see it today because it's being updated. I retrieved this in early 2007. If you do not read Chinese, you can read the English here. I highlighted parts of this introduction. It's the introduction about the press on its own website, right? As you can see here, administratively, it was a unit under the General Administration of Press and Publication of the People's Republic of China. And the publication policies were decided by the leaders of the then propaganda department of the CCP Central Committee, presently Department of Publicity. So you can see it's a high-level government office, right? It's not a commercial press. And then you can see here's a description about the major tasks the press were engaged in, then and also all these years, right? So, for Yang Xianyi and Daddy Li to work at such a, press and also translating for the press, we can imagine that, Yang would have to adopt the policy of the press, right? To faithfully and correctly introduce the great culture of China to the English-speaking world. And we mentioned that Hongloumeng is an encyclopedia of Chinese culture, right? And then we also know that, Hongloumeng is not just any piece of Chinese literature. As we said, it's probably the piece of Chinese literature. It's being said that, the late Chairman Mao loved this book. He always had a copy on his desk. He referred to it from time to time. So, when translating a book of such great importance in the Chinese culture, I think Yang had to be very careful in terms of the strategies he uses to deal with these cultural terms, concepts, right? So his eventual decision was really to give a literal translation of the text, but add a very detailed, careful note to the concept that he's translating. Actually, Gladys is his collaborator and also his wife, right? Reflected on their own translation when they were interviewed in Australia. They actually, I think, Mr. Yang and his wife, Gladys, together with two other writers from China, visited Australia right after China started opening up to the outside world after the Cultural Revolution. I think they made the visit in 1980, and they were interviewed by the editor of a journal in Australia called Hemisphere. The name of the editor is Kenneth Henderson, right? So in the interview, actually, they reflected on their own translation, compared their translation with that by Hawkes. This is what she said. She said, I think we take too few liberties. We tend to be rather pedantic, and the readers lose out because we are more literal. And then she further points out that they opted for what they call the literal translation. Again, in comparison, this is what she said. So, but we, in comparison with Hawkes, but we have been so conditioned by the circumstances in which we used to work that we are rather literal and pedestrian translators, and we're still suffering from what happened earlier. Right? She didn't really explain or elaborate what the circumstances were, but we can sort of imagine or infer, politically, they were translating the most important novel in Chinese literature for a government-funded publisher, during or right after the Cultural Revolution, right? So they had to be very careful. They had to take many things into consideration. They had to find a safe way, probably just to play safe when they, when they try to decide on the strategies and methods for translating this piece. But this does not necessarily mean that they were working under, pressure involuntarily all the time. It could be that they have been conditioned in the context for so long, it's become, part of them, or it's just their own, mindset or their own belief about translation. So as Yang himself was also part of the government system himself, I probably shouldn't use the government machine. I think it's part of the system. Why I say that? If we again refer to his autobiography, White Tiger, published by the Chinese University Press in 2002, this is what he said in his autobiography. I was elected executive committee member or advisor to many academic and political societies, such as the Chinese Writers Union, the Chinese Pen Club, the Society for the Study of a Dream of Red Mansions. You can see these are not non-governmental organizations. They are at least semi-governmental organizations, right? And he actually later on became the chief editor of the magazine Chinese Literature. It's a very prestigious, journal in China, as you can see, because his predecessor was the famous writer Wang Men, and he was the Minister of Culture when he held the position of Chinese literature. Here he referring to Wang Men, right? So Yang Xianyi succeeded Wang Men to become the chief editor of the magazine Chinese Literature. Actually, Yang had faith in the Chinese Communist Party. So again, from his autobiography, I must also admit that the Chinese Communist Party, despite all the faults committed in those years of rule, had also done many good things for the Chinese people, especially for the poor and the uneducated masses. But he was not wrong in saying that. So, but I was very pleased to see that he actually had faith in the Chinese Communist Party. He actually made his application to join the Chinese Communist Party even before the liberation, the so-called liberation or the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And then his application was finally granted in 1984. And what is interesting here, he was elected to the PPCC, People's Political Consultative Conference, the next year, right? So that's really a vertical sort of ascension, right, to this rather powerful body of the government, the PPCC, right? On the professional front, Yang Xianyi and Derrida, like they work on the Chinese mainland, right? And I believe the dominant or predominant translation principles adopted by the Chinese translation community as a whole at that time must have had an effect on their decision, right, as to how to translate this great work. And I think to many translators or translation scholars on the Chinese mainland, faithfulness has always been the most important yardstick for translation quality assessment in the Chinese mainland. Right? I think at that time, almost all the time, invariably, like when there was a conference on translation, people will be still talking about 信达雅, right? The sort of a 3-character criteria for assessing translation quality. So people generally agree that faithfulness should be the very top on the list, right? And I remember back in the days when I was a postgrad student, a MA student in Nanjing, I translated books for Jiangsu People's Publishing House. And I remember, like, every time I went to see the editor, I was actually quite scared. The one thing I was most scared of was I was accused of being unfaithful to the original, right? So I think we grew up in that context. We sort of adapted ourselves to the belief that faithfulness is the most important. If you still have doubt, we can compare these translations, right? And I think they do tell a very good story of how these 3 different regions in sort of China, look at these, look at translation differently and perform translation differently, right? Just look at the first one, English name, bedtime stories. These are the names of movies, right? And I think you can tell. Mainland, 睡前故事. If we do a back translation, if anyone who doesn't understand Chinese, you can read the back translation. So that's stories before sleep, right? More or less, bedtime stories. And then Hong Kong, 魔法童话夜. I can't both count and just will be able to say that in Cantonese. I don't want to, embarrass myself here. But you can see, a back translation would be Night of Magic Fairy Tales, right? This is quite different from bedtime stories already. And then if you look at the Taiwan translation, 东方夜谭, right? Night talks from afar, right? That 东方夜谭 also is the translation, the Chinese translation for the book, The Arabian Nights, right? So, okay, I think with this example, you can see that, the dominant poetics of translation are different across these 3 different regions. And of course, for Yang Xianyi and Derrida, they are translating in the mainland context. I would argue that they have adopted that mindset for translation already. So therefore, they might have also felt even pressure from their peer translators to hold faithfulness as the #1 principle of translation. Okay. Now, in comparison, if we look at David Hawkes a bit, you see, he was professor and later on a freelance translator, teaching and living in the United Kingdom. We know that he loved translating Hongloumeng, so he gave up his job as chair professor at Oxford University, although some people might argue a bit differently. But he translated Hongloumeng because of his love for the Chinese literature, and particularly the novel. Again, from his, this is from his correspondence. When he was invited to attend a conference in Tianjin by professors at Nankai University when they held an international conference on English translations of Hongloumeng, he declined the invitation, but he also said this. He said, I think all Hongloumeng translators must first have come under the novel's spell and later embarked on their translations of it from a desire to communicate some of their enchantment to other people, right? So it's their own desire to really share, right, some of the enchantment to other people. They may have done so in different ways and with varying degrees of success, but all of them have shared the same generous impulse. That is the love of the novel and also share this joy of reading this novel. He really translated for his reader and wanted to share the joy of reading this great novel. He said, my one abiding principle has been to translate everything, even puns. Okay, and blah, blah, blah. And then he said the underlined part, but no, let's start from a bit earlier. He says, I cannot pretend always to have done so successfully, but if I can convey to the reader even a fraction of the pleasure this Chinese novel has given me, I shall not have lived in vain. You see, this is very much like our discourse, right? 看看最后这一句，对吧? I shall not have lived in vain, right? 我此生就没有虚度, right? So I think it's very much the Chinese discourse here. So he did not really feel the constraint or pressure that Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang had. They were translating Hongloumeng at approximately the same time without knowing the other party were doing the same, right? In fact, he quoted himself sufficient freedom in translating and even in making changes about the original text, right? This is from his preface again. He said, I do so only because once or twice, in the interests of clarity and consistency, I have felt obliged to take some trifling liberties with the text and hold myself honor bound, not only to say that I have done, which I have tried to do in the appendices, but also to explain, if I can, the circumstances in which I have felt obliged to do it. Right, so as I mentioned a bit earlier, he was invited to a conference on translation of Hongloumeng in 2004. He didn't go. He declined the invitation. And then he sent a letter. This is part from his letter. He said, as I'm one of their number, one of the translators, I feel inhibited by sense of fellowship from commenting on the relative merits of their different translations. 他就说我也是译者之一，对吧？出于同行的这个尊敬呢，我不并做任何的评说，对吧？The saying that comparisons are odious may not be a good recipe for good criticism, but it holds true, I think, for translators themselves, 对吧？译者谁都不想被评说，就这意思。Right, as I said, he declined the invitation. Again, in the letter, he alluded to his freedom in translating Hongloumeng. Right, he was referring, he said, my favorite English translation, Rabelais, Gargantua, and Pantagruel by the 17th century Scottish knight, Sir Thomas Urquhart, was, I'm sure, animated by the same spirit of joyfulness and liberation. I could not hope to equal his achievement, but then I've never been a prisoner, right? A prisoner of the source text. He defended such freedom and such changes he made in the name of his concern for his English-speaking readers. He said, I can only plead for my concern for the Western readers. He actually had quite a few quotes in his, I actually had quite a few quotes from several prefaces of his, to his translations, where he explicitly said that he cared for his readers. That's why he made these changes, blah, blah, blah. Right, but then, you know, on the contrary, the youngs did not know who their readers were. You know, so again, this is what Gladys said in the interview. He can do that because, referring to Hawkes, okay, referring to Hawkes, Hawkes can do that because he knows his readership so well. He's writing for his compatriots. We are translating for faceless people, right? Interesting, right? And this is especially true of the English language translations. We are not just writing for the Americans or Australians, but for all those people in Asia and Africa who also read English, so that we do not know who our readers are. Right. So I think, you know, this is probably it's 4 o'clock. I think it's probably a good time to sort of stop, you know, because, you know, I don't think I have time to address the other two statistical findings, but I assure you that, you know, fascinating interpretations were made of these findings, okay? And I think this is a good time probably for me just to sort of summarize what I've done so far. I think what I've done today is to continue to argue for a theory of interpretive translation studies. If I found this on the web for interpretive translations. If I really have to make a statements, I would say in database empirical research, making up the big part of descriptive translation studies today, tools such as, you know, corpus, eye trackers, FNIRs or FMIs, they are important, but they are means or tools only. They are not the end. However, we recognize they are powerful tools to a good end. Okay, number one. Number two, I would say descriptions arrived at with these powerful tools are important. And we recognize they are no easy job, but we must go beyond descriptions and make sense of them in order to arrive at new, genuine understandings of translation, you know, translation process, translation function, translation product. 3, the case analysis of the 2 English translations of Hongloumeng shows that such interpretation can be done and does provide much more understanding of the translators and their work beyond the numbers. So with that, I will just conclude my talk.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Lee. Oh, that's really indeed a very inspirational talk, right? And we know Professor Lee is one of the pioneers of corpus-based translation studies and a research or translation research paradigm, which has been popular for so many years. And we all know that this paradigm has also been criticized for, you know, for the description only for the sake of description, right? But just now, Professor Lee gave us a very good example on how actually one can, you know, find very interesting explanations out of the evidence right, or patterns from the corpus-based translation studies. And I already shared this reading experience with my students before, right? And at that time, all my students found your paper really interesting, very good read, right? Now, and I really want to share with the audience more, but I know we are very lucky to have Professor Ricardo Morato, right? And that is who is your close collaborator, right? And who is very kind and agree to chair the Q&A section. But before he's going to do this job now, and let me I'm very honored to introduce to you Professor Ricardo Morato, and he's Professor of Translation Interpreting Studies and also Chinese Literature in Translation at the Graduate Institute of Interpretation and Translation at Shanghai International Studies University. And he is also the general editor of Routledge Studies in East Asian Interpreting and also general editor of Routledge Interdisciplinary and Transcultural Approaches to Chinese Literature. And Professor Morato has published extensively in the field of translation and also interpreting studies and Chinese literature in translation. And in fact, we have read so many books and also edited volumes, right? That is edited by Professor Morato as well as Professor Defeng. So Professor Morato, over to you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very. Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank Dr. Lee for your kind words that I feel I do not deserve, but thank you all the same. And I would like to thank Professor Lee for your insightful comments as well. Now, I have a couple of things I would like to say. Prior to starting the Q&A session, I would like to shamelessly share with everybody the website for the new volume that Professor Lee and I have co-edited, which is going to be published by Routledge, I think, next week. And the topic is closely related to what Professor Lee actually talked about today. So I think it's really interesting to share it with all of you. Now, I would like, if I may, to open the Q&A session with a question myself, which maybe might sound banal or overly simple, but I think it could be useful for a lot of PhD students. By the way, as a matter of fact, I know that my PhD students are here today, and I told them that I would like to hear a question from them. So I'm really looking forward to their question later on. Now, my question is very simple. It was really fascinating for me, honestly, to hear at the beginning when Professor Lee talked about the number game, and the magic of numbers, because I really think that's the main point, to be honest, when it comes to the application of corpus or corpora to translation studies and what makes the difference. Now, my question is to Professor Lee, based on your experience and knowing that sense making is the key, because that's what we have been emphasizing today, sense making is the key. So based on your experience, what are the main promises or the new emerging subfields in the application of corpora to both translation and interpreting studies for PhD students? And at the same time, what are the main challenges or the main problems they should be aware of? In other words, other than moving beyond a mere quantitative approach and exploring the meaning beyond the numbers, what other problems could PhD students or researchers in general encounter when dealing with the analysis of corpora in translation and interpreting studies? Thank you very much. That's my first question, and I would like to warmly invite everybody in the meantime to write your own questions in the chat room so that we can read your question after Professor Lee has answered my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think, Professor Detol Lee, my younger brother in translation studies, is also an expert in translation, corpus translation studies. And, Canon was the co-author of the article on translating English translation to Hongloumeng, so we might as well turn this into a sort of round table. I can share my views, and this will certainly help me with that. In terms of problems, challenges, or opportunities, I think first of all, I would say, in terms of problems, I see the number game is one of them, and the other thing is for many of us conducting or trying to start a project on corpus translation or corpus-assisted translation study, we sort of come up with a research question out of the blue. We don't really read into the theories. We don't really read into the literature, existing literature. We do not contextualize our study or problematize our research questions, okay? Because that applies to cognitive translation studies as well. I've been saying this to my students here because many of my students are doing cognitive translation studies. They just come up with a question. I mean, the questions are relevant, are valid. However, if you are really approaching the questions as a research question, you really need to build up the base of your question. Why do you have this question, right? And when this question is answered, what new insights do we gain about translation or interpreting as a whole community? I think that's the thing lacking in current data-based empirical research. We have a craze for these tools. We are excited about the corpus, about the quantification, about the use of eye trackers, FNIRS, FMI. But we basically do the design, do the statistics, but we do not, we cut off the building up part and also the interpretation part. So as a result of that, if we again reflect on the corpus translation studies, we can see many of the work has been sort of repeating themselves, because basically they are changing the corpus, changing the text that they are studying. But the design of the corpus are more or less the same, right? And then they come up with a different set of numbers. You may have a different, type token ratio, lexical density, or average sentence density, et cetera, right? And that's expected, of course. But then, we are confronted, or we are presented with all these different sets of numbers. But what do these numbers mean for us? How do these numbers further our understanding about translation process or function? We don't know, right? The reason being that we don't have the necessary build up before, which we often refer to in academic writing as the theoretical framework, right? And of course, again, because without that theoretical framework, you won't be able to explain. You will find it very hard, very difficult to really try to make sense of these numbers. And all you can say will be rather superficial. There's no in-depth systematic analysis or theorization of the findings. So I think that's the biggest problem. So actually in my chapter on sense making, I actually highlighted 4 major problems. The number game is one of them, and then this repetition of design is another major problem. I don't remember the other 2 now, but I think these are the two big problems I see in corpus-assisted translation studies today. Looking ahead, I think, the solution to me is quite obvious, right? We do need to read a lot before you really come up with the questions, right? And also these days we do, everyone speaks about question-driven research. I mean, that's true. But where do you get these questions? They do not just fall from the sky, right? You need to read into literature. You need to read into theory. You need to read beyond even translation studies, because we are a young discipline, right? We don't have to really, I don't know, my remark may be criticized. For me, I don't think we have that many, well-developed theories in translation studies yet. So that's why I say we need to read beyond translation studies, right? To come up with good questions for research. I mean, for cognitive translation studies, I always encourage my students to read into cognition, read into neuroscience, right? Before you really, try to come up with a question for your project. And of course, another major thing we should do is my main point today, right? To really always make sense of the data, because to me, that accounts for probably no less than half of the major effort or work of a research project. Okay.
This is very interesting and timely, because today, actually, with my students, we were talking about the importance, if any, of theory and theoretical frameworks. So is it fair to say that right now we have an excessive quantity maybe of case studies, but we lack a contextualization, maybe a theoretical contextualization in the broader field of translation studies? How can we move forward with the data that we have in hand? Is it fair to say that?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can actually can hear you.
I said, is it fair to say that we have an excessive amount of case studies right now, but we lack a proper theoretical contextualization, which is going to help us move forward beyond the data? Right.
I think you've got very good point there. I think that's what really worries us these days. Because, as I said, that actually relates back to my issue of being repetitive in the study. So we'll keep on doing different case studies, but we don't really sit back, or take a step back to really look at these studies and where can we be more innovative, in both methodology and also in the questions or issues we look at, for example, because I actually Detal just sent me one of his best students to work with me as my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Wu Kan. I think he's also online today. We were sort of discussing the other day. I shared my views about corpus translation studies. By the way, I always use corpus translation studies. I still refrain from using corpus-based translation studies. If I have to use one, I will always say corpus-assisted translation studies. I do have a point there, but I don't want to, start that debate today. The thing is, as I said, throughout these years, I have basically been sort of focused on corpus-assisted analysis of translator style. Okay, that's my sort of area in corpus translation studies. And I think the innovative aspect I have introduced into the area is first of all, in the design of the corpus. I remember in the early days, we worked with comparable corpus. And then I remember Richard Shell of Lancaster University talked about his innovation in integrating comparable and parallel corpus together in the same study, to sort of triangulate the findings. And I thought that was a good move. And then my introduction into this field is the addition of a subcorpora of originally composed texts by the translators. So there you would have, for example, in our analysis of, the work of Chinese translations of Ulysses, right? Ulysses by Xiao Qian and Jing Di, right? So in that study, actually, we of course we compared the translations, the two translations by Jing Di and Xiao Qian. That's the first step. We also compared the translation with the original, the English original. But I think on the top of that, we built a corpus of original writings by Xiao Qian, because our focus was on Xiao Qian. So we were able to use Xiao Qian's creative writing, as a sort of reference or mirror to examine, to verify some of the characteristics we were able to find in his translations of Ulysses. So I mean, for me, I think it's a small effort, a small advancement, but I think I see it as an innovation. So what I would encourage all of us to do is really to keep on thinking, keep on working on new ideas, so that we can be innovative, we can build upon the work of our predecessors, but not just repeating their work, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one thing. And another thing that we can, I think that again has to bring in Deteng, because I was talking to Wu Kan the other day, and his focus with Deteng has been on the functional side of translator style. Because so far, like the work, the studies on translator style have been focused on the linguistic features in the text. Okay, we look at the lexical, the syntactic, even the discursive features of these texts, and then try to identify writers or the translator's style. But I think Wu Kan is trying to bring in another aspect by referring to stenometrics, right? It's looking at how this style relates to the narrative structure of the translated text. So I see that as a new direction, or at least a very powerful addition to the existing research on translator style, using corpus as the tool.
Perfect. And according to our schedule, we have 10 more minutes. I see we have a question in the chat room, so Professor Lee can take a look as well. I'm going to read it.
I think Deteng has something to say. I can see that.
Okay.
I think Professor Lee has already answered this question in a very convincing and also very logical and also comprehensive manner. I don't know. I don't have anything to supplement. Okay, thank you.
So maybe we want to take a look together, and we have a question by I'm not sure about the tones, but maybe Li Haoyong. I'm going to read the question. Corpus-based studies are fancy in terms of numbers and charts, maybe I think. Are there any ways that corpus-based research can help study the cognitive workload of interpreting?
Well,
any comment on that?
The answer to that is yes. Okay. Three of our PhD students did their thesis using corpus as the tool. So, and of course, their focus was because they were in the general area of cognitive translation studies. So for example, Lang Yue, who is now a professor at the 中国海洋大学. I don't even remember the English name of that university, but the Ocean University of China, I think. And like she's done a beautiful work using corpus, to analyze the workload of interpreters. I think she worked on the mode of simultaneous interpreting. And my other PhD student, Dr. Liu Xiaodong, he conducted a similar study, but he looked at the mode of consecutive interpreting. So if you are interested, I would encourage you to either get in touch with these two researchers and get hold of their doctoral thesis. They have all published their work, I think, so far. Or you can probably just go to CNKI, search for their work. You'll be able to find their articles.
Perfect. We have one question about Hongloumeng by Jesse, who is asking, how did Yang Xianyi and his wife collaborate to translate Hongloumeng? I think maybe like the division of tasks or something like that.
How do they collaborate?
Yes. How did he and his wife collaborate to translate Hongloumeng?
Okay. For that, that's a, let me see. I think that's a very good question. Let me see. I hope I can do something sort of fancy for you. See if I can find it. Okay. I really wanted to do this for you. See if it works. Okay. I'm not sure if let me see I hope it works, because that really answers the question. Let me share again. I don't know whether. Okay, see if you can hear it. Okay, you may. If you cannot hear it, read the subtitles.
Okay. Yes, we can hear.
Sometimes Shini does a draft translation and I edit the English. Sometimes I do a translation and he checks it, or our colleagues check it. We may ask outside experts for help too. And I occasionally ask British friends to read the manuscript, because after 40 years in China, my English is out of date and rusty.
一般的来说，翻译中国古典文学作品，我都是先翻译出来一个初稿，然后呢，这个文字方面呢，他是英文是他的本国语言了，他的英文还是比我好，所以一般的是然后由他来加工印刷的文字。
他们两个合作起来就是翻译比较快。本来我爸爸翻译的风格也是比较快，最快的时候就干脆他就不用写，他就直接就口述，然后我妈妈就直接打字。在这个打字的过程中，就已经把他的那个英文已经做的这个就一遍就查。
Okay.
It was a very interesting document.
Right. So that answers the question, how they work together.
Yes, indeed. Now here we have a question by one of my students. I'm going to read it.
You still have another question? Okay, good.
Yes. If corpus and eye tracking are the tools that enable us to do the descriptive study, what will be the perspectives that enable us to go beyond descriptive study to reach the point of being interpretive? Is it at the end of the day still highly dependent on the theoretical framework we're going to choose, which in its nature must be explanatory and interpretive in the first place? That's the question.
Okay, what will be the perspectives that enable us to go beyond descriptive study? Is it dependent on the theoretical framework? Well, yes and no. If you're just looking at a doctoral dissertation, a doctoral project, I would say yes, of course. That's pretty much depending on your theoretical framework, your build up of the questions, right? Because with that build up, you'll certainly be in a very strong and better position to make sense of the data at the end of the day. But in general, if we look at translation studies together, I can't say, it's very much depending on the theoretical framework. It's rather that we really need to, first of all, read beyond translation studies. Second of all, when we have conducted a certain number of case studies, we need to step back and jump out of these case studies, right? And look at these studies together and then see what really new understandings do we have based on these case studies about translation overall, and what new questions do we have. And this, of course, is a cyclical process. It's not a one-stop job. It's not a one-off job, right? You have to do it constantly and continuously. And I think that's how a discipline or a research area develops and grows, right? Okay.
Jack, I hope that answered your question. Now we only have 1 minute left, and I would like to thank Professor Lee once again for your insightful lecture. And I'm going to give the floor to, I think, Dr. Lee for some concluding remarks. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Morato, and for your very, very good, how should I put it? That is the
brilliant moderating.
Yeah, very good moderation. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. A very effective moderation. Thank you. And also, I would like to thank Professor Lee, right, for giving us such a wonderful talk, right? And that's I think probably everybody agrees with me that this is really interesting, right? And we I suppose a number of us have listened to corpus translation studies, so I refrain from using corpus-based now after after listening to Professor Lee's advice, right? I probably understand why you refrain from using that now. And so this is and I think you might probably agree with me that is a really exceptional talk, right? That's quite different from the previous corpus translation studies talks, which only focus on numbers, descriptions, but and we don't know the next step, right? That is so what, right? So once again, thank you very much, Professor Lee and Professor Morato. I would like to, before the talk concludes, right, I would like to also thank my colleagues and Dr. Liu Kanglong, right, and for
thank you. We still have 3 more lectures to come, so just stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Okay, so that is partly. And we need to thank Dr. Liu, right, because and he has applied for this funding also, and without his proposal and our talk also wouldn't be possible. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, once again, and thanks to everybody for your attention. And that is the end of today's talk. And thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm doing an advertisement again.
Oh, advertisement. Okay, yeah. Please.
It's a talk that coming next week. It's with the translator, Ji Zhang, who translated 射雕英雄传, right? So translating Chinese martial arts, a conversation with Ji Zhang. So it's going to be in the form of
hybrid
conversation. So I'll be discussing with her, raising sort of questions, and then she'll respond to these questions. So I think it's going to be quite interesting, just so that if you are interested, you are very welcome to really participate. Okay. So you have the time, and if you want to, if you just search online, I'm sure you'll soon be able to find information relating to this talk. Thank you very much. Thanks to Desau, Kano, and Ricardo.
Yeah, Ricardo.
It's really a pleasure.
My pleasure. The pleasure is ours. Okay. 好，
All right，
好，谢谢廖老师，辛苦了
好，
啊，OK，
再见了，
好，再见，好，莫老师，莫冉老师，OK，拜拜。